to the beginnings of writing a case. And so the plan was that I wanted to talk to you a little bit now about what we do in terms of constructing a case, and the sort of broad content that we put into it. And then we'd like to divide you up into three groups. The first one is going to look at patient case and how to construct a good case for that. The second one will be looking at sort of communication and interpersonal skills and constructing a case for that purpose. And the third would be to look at something along the lines of a management or health systems case and look at constructing a case for those purposes. And in session one, the idea would be to, in the breakaway group one, the idea would be to identify a purpose that you'd want to achieve with writing that case, and identify some learning outcomes that you'd look for that. And then we'd come back together into the main group and sort of share some of what we'd come up with. And then in the second sort of breakaway is to populate the content of a case. Just broad high-level stuff. You can't do too much of the actual writing of it, but it's identifying the broad content that you would like for the case. And I think it's that where I wanted to talk about now. The first idea is just to take a step back and talking about learning objectives. I think it goes without saying that the learning objectives relate to something that is generalizable beyond just what you are sort of talking about at that particular point in time. So when you're doing a diagnostic case with a patient, obviously you're wanting the students to be able to do something in a similar situation for another patient. It's not only for this particular patient. If you're looking at some sort of management issue, it's not just what you can learn from that particular situation, but it's what you can learn that you can apply in your own environment. And I find that when I work with faculty members at WBS, that we have to specifically think about that, because the temptation is to think only into the case. In terms of the content of a case, we talked a little bit last week, if I remember correctly, about sort of a holistic view of things. And that's very important in constructing any kind of a case, because whatever is happening and whatever you're wanting the students to analyze and diagnose is taking place within a context. And your diagnosis and your solution doesn't happen outside of that context. It has to take that into consideration. And so I like to think of a case as having sort of three buckets of information. The one is the context in which this particular scenario is unfolding itself. And that in a management case scenario can be very varied. It can be looking at what's happening broadly in the industry, or what's happening within the legislative environment, or what's happening with the regulatory, legislative, environmental, anything within the broader environment that's having an impact on the decision that a person has to make at that particular time. Then we always put in some sort of organizational background, and this would relate to the organization in which this situation is unfolding. What is that organization? What does it look like? What's its history? How does it operate? Anything that's relevant then again to the situation you want the students to understand and diagnose. And then finally, there's what I call the story so far, which is how the situation has unfolded until this point where you've cut the case. And that's when until the problem that you're presenting the students has happened, or until this particular point in time that you're presenting to the students. And then again, it's the stuff that's relevant to that situation. You don't want to necessarily put in too much complexity, but you can add a lot if you want to make it difficult for the students to understand. And to not to understand, but to sort of sift through, because sometimes you want students to be able to sift through rubbish and sort of red herrings to find what's important. But you need to specifically plan what you want to put in to achieve the purpose that you want to achieve. Because it's very easy to just write down what looks nice and what sounds interesting. And then when you're wanting to teach the case, then it doesn't meet your purposes because it doesn't have the right information. So I think that's sort of a broad and quite quick overview, but I think that should provide us with enough to be able to go forward now. Shall we break up into the groups then? And
Great, thanks. Yeah, just before we break up to the groups, let me just quickly share the. Okay, so this is the document that you'll be working on. So I breakaway one is identify a purpose and identify some learning outcomes, and you can start writing. Whoops, sorry. You can start writing your cases, like the outcomes and so forth in there. I'll share this document on the link, so just make sure that before you go into your breakaway rooms that you access the document to have it open. There you go. And then I will quickly create the rooms.
is that way, Jonas?
Yes.
What did you do? Sorry, were you wanting me to respond to something?
No. I'm just I'm quickly creating the rooms.
Okay.
So I'll be yeah, almost done with that. Almost done with that. Yeah, right. Claire, yeah, I guess you can lead the discussion.
So in our group we didn't get very far in actually identifying an awful lot, but maybe we'll but we had a good discussion about thinking about objectives. But perhaps what we can do is we'll come to our group last, and group one, maybe you can talk to us about what you came up with.
I'm struggling to cut and paste what we discussed.
Okay, but can you permit just
one.
talk without talk
Okay,
to
no.
us without
Okay.
us seeing what's written? Yeah.
All right. So the patient case, the purpose is to counsel a patient on medication adherence, and
Okay.
the outcomes would be to establish patient rapport, to demonstrate effective communication skills as per the 5 A's, the tools for motivation. And lastly, to demonstrate cultural humility.
Okay. And I think that's those three things for me really well identified. And have you got particular students in mind to whom you would teach this case?
We didn't
haven't got
discuss
that far.
but it would be it could be either undergraduate or postgraduate, but we could choose the the penultimate or final years of medical school, or even perhaps the third or fourth years of medical school.
Okay. Because I think that's something that's quite important just to think about when you are constructing your case. Who are your students in this instance? Because you might write the case a bit differently for people who are more experienced and sort of the older students than for like the newer students. And just to have that in mind when you write is a useful thing. But I think what you've done is good generalizable objectives that the students would be able to take away from one patient to the next patient. So that's good. Let's take group two. Who were them? Who were they? Is anybody there? Goodness, we all lost. Have you lost me, or have we all frozen?
Okay, so for
Yes,
room
we can hear you.
for room two, around the interprofessional case, we spoke about the purpose. So the purpose of the case is to identify the importance of listening as an interpersonal skill. So
Okay.
part of what we said there is identify by not actively listening. So the idea that was discussed is that we might have, give them a transcript as part of the case study, as sort of transcript between a patient and a health professional, and then let them identify the challenges and so forth within. So discuss the role of multiple languages in active listening and communication to see how that applies to, the case, and then discuss cultural diversity and the impact on communication, identify what the health professionals has done well, because I think that's also important, is not just to focus on the deficit, but also, what was done well, and identify ways to improve active listening to patients. And that's it.
Excellent. And I think that's again identified sort of specific learning outcomes that you'd want the students to take away from that. In our group, we didn't get as far as that, but maybe Stephen and Kuma, you can just talk a little bit about the idea behind the case that you currently actually are using and want to take further, and then just what the purpose is behind this case.
If you don't mind, so we wanting to use the life asset in many situation as a real life situation to try and understand the kinds of decisions that people made that led to those outcomes. We wanting to use it at a first year level where we use a framework for health systems, where we present the different component parts, and the idea of the case study is to see the relationship between those different component parts over time. So like a longitudinal case study essentially. But the purpose is really, I guess, that's the purpose. It's for students to see how these component parts work in a real situation and how they then relate to each other. But we didn't get to discussing the actual objectives. We're still trying to get this. I'm still trying to make sense of how I could possibly do this better. I think what Claire mentioned is that one of the problems with such a case is that everyone knows the outcome of it already. So we might not even frame it in that sense. We might look at public-private partnerships in health and examples of where they work or don't work. And the kinds of decisions, perhaps, for example, around the decentralization of mental health care services. So, then we kind of reveal that this is, what could or should or what did happen around the situation. Yeah.
Okay, good.
To just add on what Stephen has just said, I think we spent more time interrogating how the life asset demand case as an example could actually be used as a tool to teach different learning outcomes. We got to, also on top of teaching about the PPEs to also say that in the same case, if you're teaching first years and you want to teach them about the qualities of a good healthcare system, you could still use the same life asset demand example, but of course not mention names, just use it as a case scenario where you would actually be assessing whether the components of a good health care system like accessibility, sustainability, responsiveness, etc., applied there. And if you wanted those components to come out well, what would you have done in that situation, or what would you not have done, or which of the components of a good health system would have been threatened had you not decided to move the patients from the facility where they were. So it gives us an opportunity to explore just one scenario, the many different examination levels and teaching outcomes that you could extract from it. I think that's why we ended up losing the brief and not doing what we were supposed to do.
But I think it was still a useful discussion, and I think there's stuff that we can take from there in terms of how to construct the case and to make it a useful case. Yeah. So I think that maybe now, can we break our way back into our groups and just think about the content and sort of populating in bullet point form, sort of think of it in three main headings: context, immediate background, sort of if in organizational environment, you're talking about the organization background, but it might be something else, and then the story so far. If we think of those three buckets and the kind of information you'd want to include in those sections, and then how long would we have for that, Janis? Not very long. 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 maybe?
Yeah, I
10.
think about 10 minutes.
Okay, that's
So
fine.
I'll create the rooms.
Thank you. Okay, so I hope that you found that quite that sort of productive. I think we got a bit further in our discussion than we got in the previous one. But I'm going to do some of the thing to what I did before, and just go from group 1 to group 3, just identifying sort of broad content that you think would be useful. That then, yeah. So maybe group 1.
Okay. Our purpose was to basically look at how to counsel a patient on medication adherence.
Yes.
So first would come up with patient identifiers. And in this case, it would be a 65-year-old uncontrolled diabetic.
Yeah.
The context is that it would be an outpatient consultation at a local PHC clinic.
Yeah.
So it would be a doctor-patient consult. That we realize, even though you gave us the 3 points, there's quite a bit of overlap between, especially where you put history and patient stories so far.
Yes,
so,
no, obviously there is.
Yeah.
There is.
So we hadn't got, so we were going to talk about, instead of organizational background, we would then give the medical history of the client. And regarding the situation, how the situation has unfolded so far, the nurse has done a triage investigation and noticed uncontrolled sugar, HGT and HbA1c results are abnormal. And Mr. X is now being referred for poor sugar control to the doctor.
And would you sort of run this as a bit of a role play in the class, or how would you run it in the class? This is coming from not something I asked you to discuss, but this is just thinking ahead.
Colleagues in the group?
I think run as a role play in the class. Yeah.
Okay, good. And so I think that sounds good, and I think you've got the basis now. You can go ahead and populate a case, write up the story that you can then use, and maybe Janis and I can talk about some sort of input that I could give into those cases, just on a very broad level, that might be useful. If we come to the second group, it was Janis's group, if I remember correctly.
So unfortunately, I didn't attend. I quickly had something else to do.
Yes.
So Claire? What did you?
So yeah, if you guys can just help me if I forget something. So we spoke about a few different scenarios that you could do, but we chose an intake interview with the patient in the ER. So we looked at kind of background knowledge, background information for the patient. We looked at kind of why they're there. We looked at the biopsychosocial side of it. So kind of what is their expectations of us and of the health system. We looked at their social context as well. And we didn't get very much further, but we probably also would have maybe had discussions with family members or the people that had brought them in as well, so that we can kind of look at those aspects of where it is that the health practitioner is actually listening and hearing the relevant points in that process. Keenan, anything else that I missed?
No, I think essentially we also said what we applied in the first breakaway session would be kind of conducive in this scenario as well, with establishing like language and communication dynamics and so forth.
Okay. And would you be playing this out as a role play as well, or how would you think of it being taught in the class?
So we weren't aware of the fact that it could have been a role play. We were under the impression that it needed to be a written task. So we were talking about almost having a transcript analysis or recording that could be analyzed, and then asking kind of pertinent questions to try and guide the students to try and identify. We were talking particularly about undergraduate students.
Yes.
So we felt that they need a little bit more guidance and looking for the basic skill set.
Okay.
That they need with
I mean, that's good. That's good. I mean, because you need to think about the students you're teaching to, because that makes a difference. That'll impact on what you include and how far you take it and how simple or how complex you make it. So to have that in mind is a very good idea. Yes. Good. Okay, we've got 2 more minutes, and so maybe we can just come to group 3, and we kind of turned ourselves on the head and decided, in fact, that instead of looking at Life Esidimeni for this purpose, because it's so well known, we'd look at Ebony Park Clinic. And perhaps I can just ask Guma and Stephen to talk to us about the kind of content that we would want if we were going to be writing a case that looks at the building blocks for a health system, for components of a good health system. Perhaps we can just we didn't get too far. We didn't get to cover the whole thing, but we did some interesting stuff in terms of context and the broader context and the health systems context. So perhaps Kluma or Stephen can just talk a bit about that.
Do you want to go ahead, Stephen, or should I?
Go ahead.
In trying to change the case, what we could immediately think of in our fit was the taking over of Ebony Park Clinic from municipal clinic to a provincial government clinic, and we were looking at the building blocks, and we looked more on how this process responded to the building blocks of a health system. And we looked at the background, a political context that was pushing the move, and which was a need for service delivery according to the community. So that's the service delivery aspect of the building block coming from outside. But there was no health workforce that was ready for the conversion of the clinic from a primary healthcare clinic, which was not a community health center, to a community health center with an emergency medicine room. Health information systems, yes, in the district there were existing health information systems, but the people who used to work at Ebony Park Clinic, which was now quickly assimilated into provincial system, were not using the same health information system programs as the government, but a continuity of service needed to occur the very next day. So there was a health information systems challenge. There was also leadership challenges, because we're talking of a clinic that used to be a municipal clinic, quickly moving into government policies without onboarding. We're also looking at it now needing to have a facility manager that's going to be responsive to the government policies. Medical products, it was a positive move because municipal health has a bigger budget for medicines, and they usually stock on a formulary that is more robust than the government formulary. So there was a positive gain there. We did not completely summarize and contextualize on its effects on whether it has become a good outcome or not, but I think we managed to be able to extract teaching the components of the building blocks of a health system from it.
Okay, good, thank you. So this has been, we tried to accomplish quite a lot in quite a short space of time, but I'm hoping that's been useful to get us thinking about what we would teach, the purpose behind teaching a case, and how that influences the content we want for a case, and then maybe putting together some broad outlines and ideas for it'll kickstart the writing of the case, because ultimately it would be nice if out of this process there comes some cases that you can use, and that provides a springboard for more the writing and the confidence for writing more cases that you can use in the future. Janice, I don't know how you want to take this further, but our time is up. But perhaps, yeah, we can think about that, and maybe you and I can have some discussion about that out of this session.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. And yeah, I think we can have a chat. Maybe the groups would want to sort of now, as you say, go and sort of work on the case studies, and then we could maybe review it or so on. But in terms of the dedicated time for case studies, we're basically done with the overview of cases. So the next step, I can't remember what we start with next week. Well, next week would be, we might actually have a case study session, because we split it up, the fourth session as a teaching portfolio session or a case session, with the idea of writing cases across the year, having an hour where we could sit and write cases together. So I'll see what the next session is, and then you and I can chat about a way forward.
Good, excellent. Okay.
Okay, yeah, thanks.